Hi there, welcome to this episode of the Skiff Meetings podcast, the podcast for curious professionals embracing the future of business events. My name is Abiel Neves, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Skiff Meetings. In this episode titled The ROI of In-Person Events, I have the pleasure of speaking with Anush Alexander, Chief Marketing Officer at Stova. In this episode, we talk about thinking about ROI holistically rather than one event at a time. We talk about the importance of collecting first-party data and different touchpoints at events. We talk about the advantages of building a data lake. We talk about how AI won't solve bad data. Lastly, we talk about why a streamlined marketing stack is more effective. Hope you enjoy listening to this conversation. I invite you to check out the other episodes of the podcast. You can find them on our website or by subscribing through your favorite podcast service.
Sounds good to me.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Skiff Meetings podcast. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Anush Alexander, Chief Marketing Officer at Stova. Anush, thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Miguel. Excited to be here.
So this is a sponsored episode of the podcast, sponsored by Stova. So we appreciate Stova's sponsorship, but I'm sure we're going to have a delightful conversation. So I want to jump into by starting with your introduction. Tell me a little bit about yourself, how you joined Stova, but I'd love to start from a point of when you first sort of connected with the events or the kind of events technology world. And if you want to start earlier, that's fine, but I want to make sure we get that point because I always find it really interesting to understand where you or when really you kind of understood what this world was about.
Sure. It's actually kind of an interesting story. So I'm an immigrant. My family immigrated here from Iran when I was really young, and I grew up in the Midwest. And I went to college at Wichita State, and I moved to San Francisco right after college. And I had, like many people, no idea what I was going to do with my life when I got out of college. But I got my first job at Del Monte Foods, and it was as a trade promotions coordinator. And in that role, I mostly coordinated events. I had 2 big sales events that I did every year for the organization. I did a bunch of mini events throughout the country, and it was my first role events, and I was hooked. And it was what I knew I wanted to do. It was like my gateway drug into marketing. And I transitioned into B2B marketing after that. I took a lot of event roles early on in my career, event manager, event coordinator roles. So I spent a lot of time doing events. In those days, there wasn't a lot of technology to speak of, right? So there's very little. And then I transitioned into, more senior marketing leadership roles about, 15 years ago. And, but my main focus has always been on events, right? It's such a big part of your marketing budget. And so it's always been near and dear to my heart. I think that there's been a little role in like reg, technology and things like that I've had experience with over the years as an event person, as a senior marketer. But I think COVID was the first time where I really became ingrained in what was out there and what was available, and that was due to the massive pivots we all had to take. I was the head of marketing for a tech company at the time, and we had 2 large conferences that we did for our clients every year, and our first one was April 2020, so you can imagine
Great timing.
Pure terror, and it was supposed to be in Barcelona, and so we had to make quick pivots, and then we had another very large one that we did domestically, and had to figure out quickly how to do that and how to connect and what technologies were out there. And so it's really kind of it feels like coming full circle, having joined Stova after having had a career that's centered around events my entire life. It's my first entree into the event industry from this side of it, but it's really exciting to be able to market to my peers and to do it about something that's really near and dear to my heart. That's a first for me in marketing. I've always been tangential to some other source of technology, but to actually be able to market something I know and is something that's important to me is been a really fun ride for me so far.
That's fascinating. So yeah, I mean, kudos to Stova for selecting someone with such a lot of experience in events to then do marketing for a technology platform. So that's a very refreshing approach, right? You're not sort of having to learn the audience. You know the audience.
Right,
You just have to figure out. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff to figure out, but at least the audience you're pretty comfortable with.
right, right. Exactly right.
So when you explain to friends and family who aren't in the industry, what do you tell them? Like, how do you explain your job and how do you explain how the industry works?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked me this question because it's something that, when you start a new job, you're always trying to figure out how best to articulate it. And I think the easiest way that I've found to tell people what I do is that we help companies connect and expand their communities through the power of events. And my company helps provide the technology they need to build and run and expand their events. So that's generally how I've been able to connect those 2 points, like why events, right? And then what do we do to actually help support that?
Great. Now Stova, of course, is I don't know exactly how long it's been. Probably a year now with the new name, just about,
It
right?
is just coming up on a year. We announced at IMEX Vegas last year, and IMEX Vegas is coming up again in a couple of months. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's almost a year.
And of course, you have those meeting play components, the Eventry components, and the event core, probably a few other bits, but those are the kind of three companies that have come together to kind of make Stova. And of course, you have experience in the in-person side of things and the virtual side of things. How's it going? Because there's a lot of different components, and you're having to make this all kind of match up together. I mean, is it as you expected? Is it kind of is it what are the challenges? I guess is probably the best way to face that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been doing this for a long time and I've worked for tech, like I mentioned, for a really long time and have gone through acquisitions and bringing companies together. And it's always an interesting process, right? There is a lot of excitement at bringing new technologies together. There is a lot of learning curve of figuring out how those things together well. Bringing in clients and other parts of your organization to really help figure out how to make that as usable for your clients and for your prospective clients as possible. And so a lot of it's exactly what you'd expect in that process, right? There are upsides, there's challenges. There are a lot of, integrations. There's a lot of changes that come with those types of mergers and acquisitions, but it's been really exciting. And I think it is, really interesting timing that these three organizations came together, right? With the shifts that we've seen happen in the event industry and being able to have such strong footprints in both on-site and virtual, but also to have this kind of great platform that's got all of these other components to it, from venue sourcing all the way through to analytics, which is so important, and some of the things that we've built out around that. I think is really positioned us really well to kind of weather what we're all seeing as a continued ambiguity, if you will, that
Mhm.
still exists in this industry.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time, and I think at least from our kind of view, the kind of virtual event side of things is definitely taking a bit of a hit. It's a bit different. There are still a lot of virtual events happening, but it is a different market. I think definitely
Yeah.
than even before the pandemic. I think it's kind of a constantly changing market, but trying to figure
Yeah, I
out.
think you're right. I don't think it goes back to, I think everyone kind of expected to go back to 2019, and I don't think it does that. I think it's a new normal.
Yeah, yeah, definitely resetting. But you mentioned analytics, and I know we want to talk about ROI. So let's start there. I think ROI, return on investment. How do you think about return on investment? I mean, obviously, with your past career in events, you must have been analyzing how successful they were, and then I think during the pandemic, we got used to sort of the minute the detail that you could get from analytics of kind of virtual events. With in-person events it's slightly different, but let's start at kind of trying to chip at the big topic of ROI wherever you want to start.
Oh man, I mean, listen, again, as a senior marketer, the number of times I have to hear what's your ROI on said program a day, I could probably relate to everyone in your audience that has to answer this question. And the amount of gymnastics you have to go through to try to get to quality information. So I don't know, I look at ROI particularly across my marketing programs. This isn't always just event specific, right? There are so many connecting parts of this, and I think where you looked at ROI 10 years ago and it was very, let's call it siloed to, like, I did this program this is the number of things I got, and here's the direct result. Whereas now you're really looking at the interconnectivity of all of the different things that you do and what impact that has and what incremental impact that has on your overall ROI. And so I definitely think that things have shifted from that perspective. And I think we're looking at ROI very differently, right? It is not an endpoint, but a series of engagements that are driving, relationships that you're having with your prospects or your clients.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like what you're saying. Obviously, we're trying to measure the effectiveness of events, but measuring them in isolation is probably not the right way to do it. And I think we probably started, or a lot of people try to do that, but it's better to think about it much more holistically. Now, I know one topic that we've been covering, and there's still a lot to unfold there, is this idea of first party data, and how events, I think, at least in most people's mind, are becoming more valuable because this challenge with first party data. Don't want to get too technical, but anybody who works in event marketing understands that the tracking of people online has changed and is changing, and then there's kind of less options to do that. So, sort of building big lists of leads online is not as easy. And so a lot of companies are turning to events, not only to build leads, but really as these high-end touch points, right? Is that how you're seeing this? And are you seeing it from sort of the tech perspective, this turn towards events?
Yeah, I mean, listen, in post GDPR world, it's more important than ever, right? We can't buy lists, we can't buy data, we need to get consent. But even if it wasn't an issue, it's more reliable, it's issue free. You can custom build it to really get that type of information that you need to create more curated experiences. And I think the thing that we've learned over the last few years is our audiences are changing, right? And there's a larger expectation that they're tuning out a lot more. So you have to be much smarter in the types of communication you have. And, events are a great foray into getting a lot of really specific information about your audience. And I think, some of the things that are interesting to me that we're doing next, we are working on a lot of data components, one of which is creating what we're calling a data lake, right? That takes not just your singular events and what information you have from that, but being able to look across every event you've had and pull together a series of information that tells you how your audience is reacting over time to different things. And I think that's where data goes next. For us, right? It's the same thing I was talking about with ROI, right? It's everything's been very siloed to these isolated, instances, and being able to take that data now and say, how is your audience changing? What are they looking at over time? What happens next? Is there a way to take some of that and get, very prescriptive about what might be happening next?
So help me understand this from a beginner's perspective. Data lake is the idea that you have data from different sources and you kind of bring it together in one, I guess, central.
Basically a pool, right? If you could take that information and go, okay, I'm going to take all of these different things and put in a pool, and I know you now have the ability to access
Mhm.
all of that information and be able to visualize that information and start to analyze that information as a whole.
And so it's important that systems are connected, right? Because you want
Correct.
wherever your data lake is to be connected to the
One
event
source.
management tools or your CRM, etc. Is your
Right. You can
CRM your data lake?
I mean, it can be, right? Like you can have whatever that, component is, right?
Mhm.
That takes that information, amalgamates all that information and it takes it and it gives you that pool of resources. And
Yeah.
it says, all right, I've pulled all this information from these events, these interactions, whatever this looks like. And now you've got this information that tells you here are the different places. There are this many, times that this person went to an event. This is this many times that they interacted with specific type of information. Here's how much they want to network. Here's the type of people they're networking with, right? Now that tells you a little bit of a different story and it allows you to connect with your audience very differently, right? Because now
Yeah.
you've got, intimate knowledge of who that person is and what they want.
Okay. So I know that you have your own CRM system in Stova as well, but you also connect with external CRM systems so the user can kind of select where their data or what their data lake is.
That is correct.
So let's jump. I mean, we've covered in other episodes and on our website a lot of details about kind of virtual events, and I think it's pretty obvious, or at least from a user perspective, you understand that if you click on something, there's actions that you can take online. Once you're logged in, you can kind of track those, right? But what about in-person events? Because that's where I think there may be some disconnect for some people in the sense that we got used to this data that we could collect from virtual events, like what sessions people attended, how long did they watch them, who they connected with. But now
Right.
with in-person events, how do we can we get close to that? How do we like what kind of data is realistic to
Yeah.
expect?
I think what's interesting is there is data available, right? And there's certainly ways to get data. I think there is huge opportunity for growth from an in-person perspective. But if you think about, the fact that everyone's got badges, their RFID, you've got session check-ins that happen at different sessions where you start to understand who's at what sessions and, how long they're in and out of those particular sessions. You can create, beacons or readers around different areas that could then, start to track, dwell times and interest in hotspots and things like that. You've got virtual apps or mobile apps. Sorry, not virtual apps, but mobile apps.
Yep.
And create, levels of engagement and interest in data that you can pull through. So there are definitely a lot of places that you can get data and use that data from an in-person perspective too.
What do you, I mean, it's always good to talk about what's possible, right? Because,
Mhm.
beacons, RFID, all these things. I think in practice, very few events kind of do all that, right? And it can get very expensive, let's be honest, right? Like
Sure.
to actually and to
Sure.
coordinate all that. Are there any kind of tips or advice that you can give us on things that planners should kind of look out for or areas that they should focus that might not be so obvious? We know registration data, we get that, right? Whatever you ask at registration, is really important, but also you don't want to make registration 14 pages long because people are going to drop off, right? So you want to kind of find that balance. But are there any kind of interesting touch points now from the event tech perspective that are maybe overlooked that you're saying, hey, this is actually a really good way to collect data? And I'm happy if you want to mention RFID and things like that, but anything that comes to mind that you think maybe is overlooked by planners sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some of it, right? There's a lot of opportunity at registration to capture some quality information that I don't think a lot of people take necessarily advantage of, right? For the reasons that you mentioned, you don't want to make it overly cumbersome, but I think there is a happy medium ground that I don't think everyone takes advantage of, where there's a lot of data opportunities. And I do think that, mobile apps are not inherently expensive, but there are a lot of different engagement tools within that mobile app that can give you a huge opportunity, from gamification opportunities to help people keep people engaged, but still get information, to help connect with your exhibitors, audience, polling, things like that, where you can pull a lot of information through.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunities there that I think that aren't inherently expensive, but gives you some really great opportunities to not only engage with your audience, but in the same time capture data that will be critical to the next time that you do that event.
Sure. Going back to the registration question, I've heard some people recommend a simple registration and
Mhm.
then kind of incrementally collecting data through a series of emails or some sort of kind of pre-event communication where you're slowly building up that profile rather than asking someone to kind of, complete their whole profile in one session. Are you a fan of that? Is that something that kind of you would recommend?
Yes, to a certain degree. I will say the more times that you ping someone, the less likely they're perhaps to
Yeah.
respond to it,
So if it's
right?
something really important, you probably don't want to kind of
Probably don't
depend
want to,
on.
yeah, you don't want to filter it out over a series of those things. But yeah, I think there's real opportunities to break it up a little bit, particularly, at registration, then perhaps, pre-event, where you can gather some additional information. People are excited, they're ready to
Mhm.
come to your conference, they're ready to engage with you. You can capture some additional information, and perhaps post-event as well, too, right? Where there's definitely
Yeah.
opportunities to capture a lot of information post-event, and it creates another engagement point.
Absolutely. And when it comes to things like the gamification, could you maybe, I could see how you're saying, hey, I don't know, this group of people used gamification. This group of people did something with a leaderboard or something like that without the event. Do you have any advice for how to kind of use that afterwards, right? Because I always find like, yes, you have this data from gamification, but then how do you use that in a constructive way? Because obviously there's privacy. You're not going to like know exactly like the messages or anything that people have exchanged, but hey, these people went into gamification or any other example. How do you then use that in terms of data profile? And is there like a marketing campaign that you can start, or are there things that you can do with that information afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things you can do depending on what, what type of content you're using in the gamification, right? It could be things that could help you drive, ongoing content post event, perhaps, right? And you use that information to engage, more curated experiences post event for your attendees. That could be one particular place.
Mm-hmm.
It could be engagement opportunities, right? You can really start to see that people engage in these particular ways, they don't engage in these particular ways. It
Mm-hmm.
helps you hone in on how to do that better, in post of every event that you do after that. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can use it. It really depends on what your goals are with the gamification and what types of questions you're asked and how you're using it. But I think if you have a clear goal in mind, right, ahead of time, right, I'm using gamification for X, and then I'm going to use the data for this, right? I think sometimes, and I'm 1,000% guilty of this, by the
Mm-hmm.
way. So I'm not, this is no judgment on anyone else. I think we do things because we know we need them, right? Without a clear view on why we're doing it and what we're going to do with it afterwards. And I think that's where we get lost with the data afterwards, because we've got this data, but we didn't really have a clear view on what we were planning.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that's the thing we want to avoid, right? I think that's always the challenge. I think the famous phrase is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And
Right.
and if you can build on that and kind of put processes in place of for what you're going to do with that data, I think that's the best scenario, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think part of what I'm really getting at is this idea of personalization, right? I think we kind of set the bar pretty high, or there's this like all these impressive things that we could potentially do with personalization. Um, let's start with just the concept of personalization. When we talk about personalization for event tech, what are we talking about? And then maybe you can talk about what's possible, or maybe what you've seen that really works well.
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a lot of great examples of what I think works well, right? I think that what's I've seen work well so far are things like creating, custom tracks for your attendees, right? You can really start to get very curated and the types of content that you're not only developing, but you're providing the pathway for your clients. The other place where I think personalization has worked really well is in networking opportunities, right? And really getting to a place where you're getting enough information about both parties to really connect them at a level that's valuable for both parties, and not just, oh great, I've matched this exhibitor up with this attendee and this is great. So I think those places are where I think I'm seeing the best results. I think there's huge opportunities still to come. I think, the consumer side of marketing does this really, really well. B2B has never really figured out a way to do it as well as consumer side has.
Yeah.
And I think that there's huge opportunities for growth in that perspective. And I'm excited to see what comes next. But, and part of that is just the types of data. Like I said, I don't think we've always captured enough of that to start to make those decisions, where consumer just does this great job of like, Amazon knows everything about me. It like gives me 50,000 things that I wouldn't even have thought for myself to buy. But so they do that really well. And I think that there's potential for that. I think we just need to start capturing the right information and not be afraid to ask, which I think we sometimes are.
So let's get kind of more granular here. On the Stova platform, I think you're talking about kind of content recommendations and kind of networking recommendations, right? Like, how do you do those? So how do you do those in the best possible way? What's your advice for people trying to use Stova to do that?
Well, again, same thing as before. I think you need to have a perspective on what you're trying to do so that you capture the right information, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your goal is networking and you know that there is a certain way that you think your audience wants to connect, or you want your audience to connect for a better experience, capturing that right information, getting the right data at the outset, there are AI algorithms in our platform that can help connect based on those parameters. But having a clear view on what you want or what you're looking for, I think is the most important component to being successful at the end of that.
I think that's really good advice, actually, because we can get very enamored with this idea of AI solving things or just making it
Right.
easier, and I think it does, but without that clarity of, I guess in this case, what is ROI, right? Like, what
Yeah.
is ROI for? And we know from most events, the networking component is super important, right? So, is the ROI that your startup founder meets investor, that's sort of a classic example of using event tech. If that is, then how do you build out the tools so that the AI can help you do that more efficiently, right? Because if you leave it just up to AI,
Yeah, it's
I
not
don't know.
clairvoyant.
I don't think we're quite there yet. The AI could just sort of solve everything, and it's not going to go back and change your registration form, right? If you've already kind of put that out.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's the challenge with everything, right? It's you've got to data in, data out, right? You've got to capture the right data in order to get the output that you're looking
Mhm.
for.
And from the content side, is are there any kind of key like things to consider there? I mean, we've mentioned kind of setting the goal very, very, but I think with content, it might be a little bit more challenging in the sense that, each user may have different preferences. So the ROI might be to be able to suggest sessions or suggest tracks efficiently, but what that looks like can be very different, even for different groups of users. Any thoughts on how to kind of make that work as best as you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think same as before, you don't want to get too lost in the number of options that you can give folks, right? You can only create so much content and it needs to be tied into what you're trying to accomplish. There's that there's that constant balance as a marketer of I'm doing these events for a business purpose, right? But you're also looking to engage your audience and create better experiences for them. And so you're always trying to make the content both valuable but tied back, right? And trying to figure out how to do that in a
Mhm.
way that you aren't confusing either yourself or your audience is always the balance, right? So I think less is more in some of these cases. So really trying to understand what you're trying to accomplish and how to get there and how to get the information you need from your clients and provide that experience for them. I know I feel like I keep saying the same thing over and over again, and it's probably just my own experiences, but having a clear view always of what you're trying to get to
Yeah.
is going to get you a better result in the end. And like I said, I feel repetitive in saying that, but maybe it's my own neuroses that is driving that
No, I
conversation.
completely agree. And, I was recently on the Stova podcast as well. Sorry, not Stova podcast, on a webinar with Stova. And kind of my advice was essentially the same. It was more about the human factor and kind of making decisions and making sure that the making sure that you have the right resources allocated to do things and that you plan ahead. Like when you collect all that data, you need to be able to manage that data and do something useful with that data. The technology helps, but it
Right.
only gets you so far. If you don't have the resources in place to be able to do that, then yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's it's really, really challenging to kind of get it all working.
Yeah.
And what about leads? For a lot of events, either people putting on their own events to get leads themselves, or if they have exhibitors at their events, be they virtual or in person. Tell me a little bit about how to work with that. Is it all about batch scanning? Are there other ways to kind of qualify and quantify the leads so that you're kind of, because that's a big part of ROI, right? Because if you're
Right.
if you're doing events from a marketing perspective, then leads, whether they're top of funnel or sort of further down the funnel, they're an important part of that. Um, Start wherever you want to start, but I'd love to get your take on sort of leads when it comes to event technology. Like how do we use event technology for the best way to get leads?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there are the obvious ways, right? There is the lead retrieval mechanisms that you use with the scanning the device, you're getting lead information. And once again, the more information that you take in, and the great thing about lead retrieval today is that you can put as many different components on that in terms of questions that you put or additional information that you're putting on lead. It has to be practical, right? If you're standing in a booth, you're not going to type out a novel with every
Yeah.
single lead you're
You're talking
tracking.
about when somebody's scanned, then you can make a note on that scan, or have a number of different fields kind of already preset up so that you can fill that in. But yeah, of course, the
Right.
sales team wants to keep having conversations and not stop and
100%.
fill out a whole form.
But I think some level of that lets you again segment out those leads so that then you can have more meaningful conversations post those events. And that's really what about the leads are about, right? It's about having the ability to take those leads and then turn them into something else, right? And that only
Yeah.
happens through engagement. And so that's where I think the real opportunities are. And I think some of the things that we're seeing today, where the opportunities with things like virtual exist is that ongoing content, that ongoing engagement that you can have with leads, the continuing the conversation, continuing the education, and having that impact. I think that's where there's real opportunities to not just have these again siloed experiences where you do set event, you do capture those leads, and then you don't know what to do with them again post event, right? And you're
Yeah.
like, I don't know who this person was. I'm not sure what the conversation was. I don't know what to make happen next. Now you have the ability to take that and kind of take next steps and move them down from step to step.
Are there any features from the Stova platform that you'd highlight when it comes to leads? Any kind of
Yeah, I
passive
mean,
lead?
our lead retrieval system's, fantastic. Like I said, there's the ability to capture and segment a lot within the system, which I think is really valuable. I love it when we're at trade shows and we get our lead retrieval systems because I know I have the mechanism to start to segment those leads out very quickly and easily at the show. And then I've got live access to them. I've got the ability to go in there and then every night go in there and make additional notes and segment those out, pull leads that I know are hot leads that the sales team needs to immediately go follow up with, things that need to go segment back out to marketing for additional follow through and engagement. That I think is really valuable, being able to just on the fly be able to pull those, because the hot leads are hot leads. The longer you sit on them,
Mm-hmm.
the less likely you are to actually have anything come from them. So being able to segment those out quickly, being able to have that follow through, having that live access to them means that there's a chance that those turn into quality business for your organization.
For sure. So if I understood you, you do some qualification kind of live when you're at the
Mhm.
booth,
Mhm.
but then you also kind of later that day or that evening go through and kind of do more, I guess, a more in-depth qualification. Is that sort of your process? I guess
Yeah,
I think this might be
that's our
interesting for
process.
listeners. Yeah.
Yeah, that's our personal process. Is that where we can, because you have to do that where information's fresh, right? And try to get as much in the moment, and then those really strong conversations you're going to have recollection of those, and you're going to want to make sure that those notes are attached, and it comes back to ROI, right? I'm sure other organizations have this too. If I'm getting budget the next year, the more ROI to show for said trade show or event or whatever is going to ensure that I get the budget for that next year. So the more that you can tie back to that, the better ROI you have coming out of that event.
Yeah. And is that your advice, I guess, for making it manageable? You want teams to understand data, any sales team or anybody really working in events, but not everybody's going to have a in-depth understanding of technology, right? Like, how do you best manage that? What's your advice to clients essentially?
Yeah, I mean, you can only manage what you track, right?
Hmm.
So you start there. You can manage what you track. You start small and work your way bigger, right?
Okay.
Today I'm gonna figure this particular thing out. I'm going to manage it. I'm going to track it. Once I, have excelled at that particular thing, I'm going to continue to expand on whatever data I'm capturing and how I'm using that.
Yeah.
Again, speaking for myself, I tend to, want to boil the ocean at times rather than just focus on meaningful experiences and meaningful points of data that I can actually use, and that's how it makes it manageable for me, is really just trying to hone in on two or three things I'm trying to accomplish with every particular campaign or event or whatever that is, and then capturing the data to help me get incrementally better at that every single time.
I think that's excellent advice, not trying to do everything with all data in one go, right? And especially when you have
Mm,
multiple people in a team and then different sources of data. I think that's really important.
yeah.
What's your advice for meeting professionals that are really looking to master this idea of data management?
That's a really good question. I would say like everything, it's trial and error, and don't be afraid of the error part of the trial and error, because that's where you learn the most about what you're capturing and how it works and how you can manage it. So that's probably my best advice is don't be afraid to try something new. Don't be afraid to get out of your comfort zone when it comes to trying new data capture, or you know pivoting that information in a different way to see what results you get from it. I think that that's
Mhm.
where I learn the most, is through the 1,001 mistakes I make, is one successful outcome that will take me on to the next one. And that's been my experience with data, is I've done a lot more wrong than I've done right, but it gets me better every single time.
Yeah, I love that. And so, I mean, the Stova platform is, a kind of all-in-one platform. You have pretty much anything that anybody could want for events in one platform. There's obviously other ways to do that. You can connect through APIs, something like that, to different platforms. But tell me a little bit about the advantages that you see, particularly in data management, because I think that's a really key thing about having a sort of larger system that can do a lot of different things rather than trying to connect different systems.
Yeah, I think like with any marketer, right? Like your marketing stack is only as good as the components that you have within it, right? And the less components, the easier it is to capture that data. And event tech is no different. So being able to have all the information that you need, from the content to how you've built that event, and then the attendees that you've had engaged with it, and the leads that came out of it, the exhibitors you had, not just for, again, that siloed event, but across your event portfolio. I think one of the changes I've seen personally for events over the last few years is, when I started in events more than a few years ago, I won't say how many years ago, it was very, I did this event, I got the information, right? And I think that the change we now see is that you can and should look across all your events to see how those things tied together and what that looks like. And I think that's the advantage of using, a platform like Stova, where you have the ability to kind of build event after event after event and start to see that data over time and what that looks like in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. How are those things changing, and how are you changing along with it? And how are your attendees changing as a part of that? I think that's where the data becomes really compelling. And that's where, trying to, do integrations to get there works, but it's very different when it all just houses in one place. Not to mention just the complexity of having to manage 4 or 5 vendors for an event, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's where kind of a single system really kind of shines in many ways, right? You have that kind of like single place. And also in terms of learning how to use the system. I think
Yeah,
that's also key,
exactly
right?
right.
Yeah, that
Exactly right.
onboarding several different platforms, and
Yeah.
then
Well, that's like
somebody
a
in the
nightmare.
team is an expert in one platform but not in another, it
Yep.
becomes a
Yep.
really big
And again,
challenge.
those things have to play together, right? In a sandbox too, which is,
Yeah.
sometimes great and sometimes not.
I'd like to zoom out a little bit. I think we were talking about data and ROI, and I think it's super interesting topic, and I'm glad that we were able to dive in. But any kind of things that you would like to see change in the industry? And I have one suggestion, but I think I'd love to kind of get your thoughts anyway. But as a whole, as an industry, what could we be doing better, and what would you like to see change?
I think the one thing I'd like to see change, maybe, and I always speak for myself, right, as a marketer and event person when I say these things. So this isn't judgment on anyone else's. I think we need to open ourselves up to change a little bit more than we have in the past, right? It's an industry that has not progressed as much as it could. COVID obviously forced some change, and we're seeing that continue. And I think there's a massive amount of opportunity that we just aren't realizing yet in the event
Mhm.
space. It's such a big part of our budgets. It's so important to what we do, and I just want to see us like really start to expand and really accelerate from a technology perspective. I think there's really exciting times ahead for this industry, and I'm excited, and I hope everyone grasps that in the same way that I am, or that I hope they will.
Yeah, change is it's always challenging, right? Change is tough, and I think for a lot
Yeah.
of people it is tough. But there's a lot of benefits potentially from change. My suggestion was kind of similar to that, but you've mentioned a few times this idea of not focusing on events as sort of the one thing or single kind of occasions, and thinking about events more holistically and thinking about several events and kind of consistently kind of mapping that out. That's not always easy, right? Because from an event, from a logistics perspective, from a sort of planning perspective, it's a big rush, right? You're really trying to get this one thing to work, and then you might have to do a completely different event for another client or another part of the company or whatever it is, and then you're sort of coming back to the same event or same series of events, like a few months later or whatever it is, or maybe a year later. Is that an issue, and is there any way to overcome that? Because I totally get the advice of thinking about it more as a series of touch
Yeah.
points, right? But how do we, from a sort of planning perspective, any thoughts on how we can make that easier, or kind of how we can change our thinking about it?
Yeah, I think it's a few different things, right? One is the technology itself, right, can really help enable that and help support that process and really help start to show the value of incrementally changing your events over time. I think practically, right? I think again, having been in that role as an event person, it is all hands on deck, every single one, and it feels like you're kind of screaming into every single event, and it's hard to get out of your way enough to be able to say, all right, outside of the crazy schedule that I have, I need to stop and think about like how this is going to, impact the next event and what types of things I need to get to so that I'm seeing change over time, and how am I looking at how these things connect. And so that's really important, being able to, kind of get out of your own way enough to be able to do that. And I know that's not always easy, right? You don't always have enough staff. Sometimes, you're being challenged to throw an event together in a time period that seems insurmountable. And now, event planners are dealing with last minute reg and all sorts of things that are making that even more difficult. So I think technology can really help support that. And I think there's an opportunity for, as you see platforms like us that are much more holistic, that lets you tie things together, let you pull that data together, will actually let you, start to track those events over time as a series and not as a one-off. But I think that's the biggest challenge. Is it's a mindset change to a certain
Mhm.
perspective. Um,
It,
and I'm starting to see that with a lot of our clients, right? I definitely see this as there are a lot of clients out there that are really looking at these as more of a series of events, and really, organizing themselves from that perspective. So I think that the change is happening, but I think fundamentally that's been the challenge, is just not enough heads at it. And so
yeah.
you're focused on the things you can focus on.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there is a lot of staff shortages in different areas, so that's always a challenge. But I think it's interesting what you're saying, and also this idea of the data lake kind of
Mhm.
increasing, right? When you have more data, when you can see more
Yeah.
patterns, when you kind of see more analytics, tell you more, then you see the benefits, and hopefully that kind of mind shift changes so that you can look forward to collecting more data and to having more kind of event data coming in.
Yeah, the head of development for our VP of development for our company calls it data liberation, which I love. I love that term. It's liberating your data so
Like
that you
it.
can use it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Love it. Nush, I think you've covered a lot of different areas. Is there anything else that you want to cover in terms of ROI, data, and kind of in-person events?
No, this has been a really fun conversation. Thank you, Miguel.
You're very welcome, and thank you for being on the podcast. So, last question that we ask all our guests is to recommend somebody else that should be on the podcast. And I would ask for recommendation, but also if there's anything in particular that you think we should ask them about, I think that would be really fun.
Meg Fazy, of Phase WD is fantastic. She is one of the people she's like, I call her my event guru. I call her all the time, and she's given me a lot of perspective on the industry. She's seen a lot. She's been in the industry for a long time. I think what's great about her is you can pretty much ask her anything. She's got a particular expertise around sponsorships, which is an interesting conversation to have today. But she's got such a varied experience in events and event technology that I think she'd be a fun guest for you to have on.
Perfect. We'll definitely get in touch with Meg and make it happen. So I look forward to it. Anush, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Stova, for sponsoring the podcast. And listeners, hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And please tune in again next week for another episode of the Skip Meetings podcast.
Thank you.